The Xal'kyr Dominion did not fear war. They were war. For centuries, their empire had expanded through relentless conquest, absorbing weaker species, dismantling resistance before it could take root. Their fleets, polished obsidian against the void, patrolled the borders of newly subjugated systems, daring any to challenge them. Until tonight, Admiral Threxos stood on the bridge of his warcruiser, Scourge of Infinity, its control panels pulsing with the muted crimson light of battle readiness. His eyeless face one of the many refinements of his species' evolutionary path, which as he studied the latest tactical feed. An unidentified object had drifted into their sector. Unregistered, unaccompanied, humans. The upstart species that had defied the natural order. They were primitives, still shackled by their organic limitations, yet somehow, they continued to expand. They were small in number, but impossible to crush completely. A virus that never died, only adapted. This ship, though it was a mistake. Threxos leaned forward, mandibles clicking. Give me a full scan. His second-in-command, Yulish, a weary intelligence officer with a knack for dissecting enemy weaknesses, nodded and relayed the command. Within seconds, a sweeping pulse rippled outward from their lead destroyer, washing over the drifting vessel like an unseen tide. Vessel classification: human warship. Designation: unknown. Condition: derelict. Derelict, Threxos repeated. He did not like the word. It was sloppy. Yes, Admiral. Ulish's fingers twitched across his display. No power signatures, no active defense systems, no transmissions. Threxos studied the visual feed. The ship hung motionless, silhouetted against the dim glow of a nearby nebula. Dark gray plating, battle-worn but intact. No markings, no insignia. It was sleek but heavy, predatory in design like a beast lying in wait. It was too large for a standard patrol ship, too small for a dreadnought. An anomaly. Could be a ghost ship, Yulish offered. Perhaps they suffered a reactor failure and drifted beyond recovery. We should seize it before their kind comes looking. A tactical prize. The thought pleased Threxos. His kind had studied human technology before, salvaged their pitiful attempts at innovation and re-engineered them into something useful. He waved a clawed hand. Prepare a boarding team. Yes, Admiral. The skin results updated. Yulish flinched. What? Threxos' turn. His patience thin. The intelligence officer hesitated. Strange. The readings are inconsistent. Threxos narrowed his sightless gaze. Explain. Yulish exhaled slowly, fingers tightening against the interface. No active power core, yet internal temperature fluctuations detected. Faint, subtle, like residual heat signatures, but to regular. Threxos frowned. Define regular. Like something is moving inside. Silence spread across the bridge. No one spoke. No one wanted to. The Admiral processed the information coldly. An abandoned ship should be cold, dead, but this one, it was breathing. His mandibles twitched in irritation. Residual systems? Life support, perhaps. Ulish's eyes flicked back to the scan, doubt seeping into his voice. Then why does it appear localized? Threxos did not like this. He did not like this at all. Yet, his pride refused hesitation. He was Xal'kyr. He would not flinch at the corpse of a lesser species. Like a tractor beam, he ordered, bring it into formation. Our boarding crew will extract whatever data they can. Yulish hesitated. Admiral, perhaps we should. Threxos snapped his gaze to his subordinate. Do you question my order? A long pause. Yulish exhaled through his nostrils and lowered his head. No, Admiral. Threxos turned away, satisfied. Then execute. The Xal'kyr fleet moved in, warships aligning into formation. A pale energy beam lanced out, latching onto the derelict. The moment it connected, the lights on the human warship flickered on. One by one, a pulse rippled outward. The scanning system shorted. The bridge of the Scourge plunged into darkness. Then came the whisper. Not through the comms. Not through the scanners. Inside their heads. You shouldn't have looked. The scourge of infinity shuddered as the whisper faded. Admiral Threxos froze. The bridge, moments ago bathed in the steady glow of tactical displays, was now. Only the dim emergency lights remained, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The crew murmured uneasily, their usual discipline faltering. He clicked his mandibles in irritation. Report. Ulysses' hands danced over his console, but his display flickered erratically. I don't know. Systems are rebooting. What happened? The intelligence officer swallowed. Some kind of pulse from the human ship. It wasn't an attack. But then why is my ship blind? Silence. No one had an answer. Threxos bared his fangs. Restore sensors. Now, Ulysses worked furiously, rerouting power. Bit by bit, the Scourge's systems limped back online. Tactical holos flared to life, glitching and stuttering before stabilizing. But the skin results, they had changed. Admiral, Ulysses breathed. You need to see this. Threxos stepped forward, towering over the display. The human warship was no longer cold. Before, it had seemed derelict, lifeless metal adrift in the void. Now, heat signatures surged through its structure, coursing like veins and living. Sections that had read as inert now pulsed with activity. It was waking up. Threxos' grip tightened on the edge of the console. Explain this. I can't. Ulysses' voice was strained. I thought this was just a ship. But Admiral, the skin patterns, they resemble biological activity. The hull is behaving like an exoskeleton. Some sections are growing warmer, others cooler. It's as if the vessel is. He hesitated. Alive, he finally said. Threxos growled. Impossible. I thought so too. Ulysses' hands twitched over his controls. But our scans are being altered. Threxos turned sharply. Altered? Ulysses' pupils dilated. Admiral, the ship is scanning us back. A cold ripple spread through the bridge. The crew, hardened warriors of the Xal'kyr Dominion, shifted uneasily at their. Threxos exhaled, slow and measured. End transmission. Cut the scan. Ulysses paled. Admiral, that's the thing. We're not transmitting anymore. The human ship is still. A new alert flashed across the tactical display. Unauthorized data link detected. Systems compromised. It's inside our systems. Ulysses' voice cracked. Threxos' claws raked across the console, tearing deep into the metal. Block it. Cut the feeds. Ulysses scrambled to sever the connection. But it was too late. The lights on the human warship shifted. Not random flickers. Not glitches. A pattern. A pulse, traveling along its hull in a rhythmic, deliberate sequence. It wasn't malfunctioning. It was speaking. A distorted signal crackled to life over the comms, unintelligible at first. Then, it adjusted, words forming, broken yet recognizable. Reading complete. The voice was human but wrong. Hollow. Stretched. As if it belonged to something that wasn't meant to speak anymore. Then, the fleet's power surged. Every Xal'kyr warship information flickered and dimmed. Consoles sparked, engines fluctuated, targeting systems misfired. Panic rippled through the command deck. Reports flooded in. Weapons are failing to lock. Shields are fluctuating. Gravitational anomalies detected. Threxos refused to be shaken. He had conquered entire systems. He had annihilated civilizations. But now, he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear. Not yet. But something close. His hands clenched into fists. Ulysses analyzed the transmission. Now, the intelligence officer's face was slick with sweat, but he obeyed. His fingers blurred over his console, dissecting the waveform, running it through decryption algorithms. And then he froze. His hands stopped moving. Threxos narrowed his eyes. What is it? Ulysses opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His eyes were wide, empty, staring into the display. Threxos shoved him aside and looked for himself. At first, the waveform was just noise. But as the Admiral watched, the distortion shifted, aligning into something. A biometric signature. Not a distress signal. Not a warning. A response. And the result was horrifying. The human warship wasn't just alive. It had a crew. Not biological. Not flesh. But they were still inside. The signatures were melded into the structure itself. A fusion of metal and mind, of nerve endings stretched across bulkheads. The last recorded life signs weren't dead. They had become the ship itself. Threxos staggered back. A deep, static-laced breath echoed over the comms. A voice, warped and fractured, yet unmistakably human. You look too deep. The lights inside the Scourge of Infinity flickered once. Then everything went dark. The Scourge of Infinity was blind. Not just dark blind. The ship's systems weren't offline in the conventional sense. They were gone. Tactical readouts, comms, fleet coordination, they all vanished, replaced by an eerie, suffocating silence. Admiral Threxos stood motionless, his fingers flexing in the dark. He refused to acknowledge the icy sensation creeping down his spine. The Xal'kyr did not fear the unknown. They conquered it. But this was something else. Somewhere in the gloom, Yulish let out a ragged breath. Admiral, what do we do? Threxos hated the weakness in his voice. He hated that he had no immediate answer. Then a single light blinked on. Not from their ship. From it, the human warship remained motionless, silhouetted against the nebula beyond. But its interior was lighting up one quarter at a time, in sequence, as though something inside was waking up. Send the boarding crew, Threxos ordered, his voice sharp, broken no. Yulish turned his head sharply. Admiral, that's madness. We still don't. A single click from Threxos' mandibles silenced him. This is not a debate. Yulish's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He relayed the order. Within minutes, a Xal'kyr boarding craft detached from the Scourge, cutting across the void toward the silent warship. Its hull shimmered faintly as it approached, the boarding thrusters guiding it gently to a docking hatch. A docking hatch that should not have opened. Yet as they approached, it did. The doors peeled apart, revealing a darkness so deep it felt hungry. The Xal'kyr Marines hesitated. Hardened warriors, bred for battle, standing at the threshold of something. Then their commander, Captain Varlos, barked the single order. Go! And they stepped inside. The first thing they noticed was the silence. No hum of engines. No air circulation. No residual echoes of crew movement. The second thing they noticed was the walls. They weren't metal. Not entirely. They pulsed. Varlos' helmet feed transmitted data back to the Scourge, relayed directly to. The Marine suit sensors struggled to analyze the material around them. It wasn't just metal. It had organic elements, fibrous layers, living tissue woven into the structure. It didn't make sense. Threxos' claws curled against his armrest. This ship was supposed to be human-made. Yulish's breath came fast. Admiral, this isn't just a ship. The boarding team pressed forward, moving in careful formation through the dark. Their weapons were ready, but the enemy was nowhere. That was the problem. Where were the crew? There was no blood, no bodies. Yet the ship felt lived in. Used. Watched. Then came the whispers. They weren't over comms. They weren't being transmitted. They were inside their helmets. Inside their skulls. Fragments of human voices, speaking in broken, layered tones. Overlapping. Unintelligible at first, then slowly aligning, forming words. Help us. Varlos halted. His entire squad flinched. They made us. Trapped. We are trapped. The Marines swung their weapons in all directions. But there was nothing. Nothing but the walls, shifting ever so slightly as though listening. Then a scream. A Marine at the rear of the squad vanished. No sound. No struggle. 1 second he was there. The next gone. Varlos snapped around. Check vitals. The Marine's life sign flatlined instantly. No transition. No struggle. Just erased. His body didn't hit the floor. Because there was no body. Threxos gripped his throne, watching the feeds flicker with static. This was wrong. All of it. Ulysses' voice was a strained whisper. Admiral, I think we've made a mistake. Threxos refused to entertain weakness. No, we need to know what this is. Then movement. On the live feed, the shadows shifted. The Marines caught it in their helmet lights. A figure half formed from the darkness humanoid. But wrong. Its face was a stretched, warped version of what must have once been human. Its eyes hollow sockets, its mouth stitched into the wall itself. It turned its head, not with muscle, but with a slow, mechanical grind. Then it spoke. We are still here. The Marines opened fire. The moment the first shot was fired, the ship reacted. The walls convulsed, sending a deep tremor through the structure. The human forms embedded in the walls twitched, mouths gasping in silent agony. Then, the floor opened. Varlo's squad fell into darkness. A scream cut short. Helmet cams flickered. Static overtook the feed. Then, a new biometric reading flooded Ulysses' display. The Marine squad was still alive. But their vitals, they were changing. Threxos rose to his full height. Pull them out. Now, Ulysses' fingers blurred over the controls. But he stopped and stared. The Xal'kyr boarding team's life signs didn't flatline. They were being rewritten, merged. Their signatures were blending, dissolving into the ship's systems. One by one, their life readings synced with the ship's core. They weren't being killed. They were being absorbed. Threxos' mandibles flared. Cut the link. Recall the remaining fleet. Ulysses' mouth was dry. Admiral, what if we can't? Then, a new signal appeared. Not from the Scourge. Not from the boarding team. From the human warship. The voice returned, layered in static, but undeniably human. You shouldn't have come. The lights across the fleet flickered violently, and every Xal'kyr ship information began to shut down. The Scourge of Infinity was dying. Admiral Threxos could feel it. Not in the way a ship should die under fire, crumbling under the weight of superior enemy force. No, this was different. Worse, the lights flickered, but they weren't just failing. They pulsed, an eerie synchronization with the human warship. Systems shut down, one by one, not with the chaotic overload of an attack, but with the slow, methodical certainty of a predator suffocating its prey. This wasn't war. This was something else. Something that had waited to be found. Something that was never supposed to be woken up. Threxos turned to Ulysses, his intelligence officer's face slick with cold sweat. His fingers trembled over his console. Status report, Threxos demanded, his voice sharp, deliberate. Ulysses exhaled, staring into the data feed like it was a tombstone. Admiral, the fleet is shutting down. I can see that, Threxos growled. Why? Ulysses struggled for words. I don't know. It's the ship. It's interfacing with our systems. It's not just sending signals. It's rewriting them. Threxos' mandibles clenched. Then cut the link. I can't. Ulysses turned slowly, his eyes wide with something Threxos did not like seeing in. Not hesitation. Not doubt. Fear. This isn't a data breach, Admiral, Ulysses said, voice hoarse. This is something deeper. Threxos stepped closer. Explain. Ulysses swallowed hard. It's not hacking us. It's integrating us. Silence. Even the bridge crew stopped moving. Threxos processed the words. He was not a superstitious being. He did not believe in myths, and ghosts, and things that defied war and logic. And yet, his entire fleet was dying because a dead ship had looked back at them. The human warship loomed in the void, untouched, its jagged, alien metal hull glistening like fresh scar tissue. It wasn't moving. It didn't need to. The Xal'kyr fleet was crumbling under the weight of its presence alone. One by one, their warships shut down, their weapons useless, their defenses dissolving into nothing. Tactical displays across the bridge flickered erratically, struggling against in. And then, a new transmission. No distortion. No static. This time, the voice was clear. And it came from inside their own systems. Fire if you want. A pause. It won't change anything. Threxos had waged war for over a century. He had burned planets, crushed rebellions, and shattered armadas. But in that moment, standing on his own bridge, staring into the abyss of an enemy that should not exist. For the first time in his life, he hesitated. His hand hovered over the manual override, the last command he could give. A fleet-wide firing order. The only thing stopping him was logic, because he knew, in his bones, it wouldn't work. The fleet's primary weapon arrays were online, but they wouldn't lock. Targeting systems drifted, refusing to acknowledge the human warship as a valid. It was as if the ship wasn't there at all. Or worse, as if it was everywhere at once. Admiral, one of his officers, gasped. Threxos turned, just in time to see the first ship implode. The Xal'kyr destroyer, Wrath of Varus, shuddered violently. The crew aboard never had a chance. One moment, it was intact. The next, the ship's exterior plating bent inward, crumpling like wet paper. Not in an explosion, not from external fire. It was being folded, its structure twisting unnaturally, like metal being. The ship didn't break apart. It was absorbed. The process was silent, slow, and the worst part, the crew never screamed, because they weren't dying. Threxos watched their life signs merge with the human warship's core systems. Hundreds of Xal'kyr, not dead, just taken. Rewritten, he could see their biometrics shifting. Their life readings weren't disappearing. They were being converted into something else. Something not Xal'kyr anymore. The Scourge's bridge crew was silent. None of them could breathe. None of them could look away. Then, another ship went dark. Then another. One by one, the Xal'kyr fleet was being erased, their ships drawn into the orbit of something that should never have existed. Threxos' claw slammed down on the emergency fleet command panel. Fire. Everything. The remaining ships obeyed. They unleashed hellfire, their combined arsenal screaming toward the human. Missiles, plasma bursts, singularity warheads, the full force of Xal'kyr firepower, an attack that had wiped out entire civilizations before. The human warship did not move. It absorbed the fire, not with shields, not with defenses. It took the impact, its hull rippling like water, dispersing the force like it. Then, it grew. Its outer plating expanded, thickened, its surface shifting, adapting, becoming. Like a beast devouring flesh and making it its own. For the first time in millennia, the Xal'kyr had found something they couldn't. And it was laughing at them. A new transmission. The final one. It wasn't sent through comms. It bypassed their systems entirely. It played inside their skulls. And this time, the voice was not distorted, not broken, not struggling to form words. It was calm, cold, final. This is what war means to us. This is what we become. Remember that before you ever skin us again. The human warship flickered. Then, it was gone. Vanished, without a trace. And the Xal'kyr fleet was in ruins. Silence stretched across the battlefield. The Xal'kyr had survived wars. They had never lost before. But now, they would never speak of this again. Because some wars didn't end in victory. Some wars ended with a warning. And the message was clear. The next time the Xal'kyr dared to skin a human warship, they would not be allowed to leave. The Xal'kyr fleet was gone. Not in the way war usually ended. There were no wrecks, no drifting debris fields, no burning remains of their once mighty warships. There was just absence. Dozens of ships had vanished, folded into something they could not comprehend, leaving behind only a handful of survivors to bear witness. Admiral Threxos stood rigid on the bridge of the Scourge of Infinity, his clod, hands gripping the edges of his command console with a force that should have. He did not feel the usual rage of a defeat. There was no enemy left to fight, just a black void where the human warship had been. And the last words it had spoken still echoed in his mind. This is what war means to us. This is what we become. Remember that before you ever skin us again. The transmission had not been a warning. It had been a promise. And the Xal'kyr knew better than to test the resolve of something that should. The remaining Xal'kyr warships drifted in place, their crews in shock, too stunned to speak, too horrified to process what had happened. Some officers on the Scourge had collapsed in their seats, their mandibles trembling, their bodies locked in a silent primal horror they had never known. Yulish, once sharp and calculating, stood frozen, staring at his no longer meant anything. "Admiral," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, shaking. I think it let us live." Threxos turned his head slowly. His face was unreadable. Yulish swallowed. "It took our ships, our soldiers, but it left us." "Why?" Threxos didn't answer. He didn't know. A war fleet had come to claim a derelict prize. Instead, it had been claimed. And for some reason, they were still here. A deliberate choice. Threxos' mandibles twitched. His warriors had been absorbed, rewritten into something inhuman, something that was not supposed to exist. And yet, he had no delusions. This was not mercy. This was a warning. The fleet had not been defeated in battle. It had been judged, and the verdict had been decided before they even arrived. A new signal pulsed through the Xal'kyr fleet's fractured systems. At first, it was incomprehensible noise, fractured and broken. Then it aligned. The bridge lights dimmed. Every surviving Xal'kyr ship received the message simultaneously. It wasn't just broadcasted. It was felt. A final, singular transmission. From the human warship. But the voice this time, it wasn't the same. It wasn't just a voice. It was many voices, layered into one. Voices that had once belonged to soldiers, captains, commanders, civilians all. Merged into something that had left humanity behind long ago. And when it spoke, it was not directed at them. It was speaking to something else. Designate, Xal'kyr. Observation complete. Response, contained. Proceeding to next system. Then, silence. A silence that stretched across the fleet, across the remains of those who had. And then the horror set in. Ulish's hands clenched. His breathing hitched. "Admiral," he whispered. It wasn't talking to us. Threxos' mandibles flared wide. The realization settled over the bridge like a shroud of death. That message, the cold, mechanical confirmation of their destruction. It had not been an exchange between enemies. It had been a status report, a calm, procedural message from one entity to another, which meant it was not the only one. Somewhere, out there, there were more. The Xal'kyr were not an empire that feared war. They thrived on it, perfected it, but now, standing in the aftermath of something they did not understand, they finally felt what their enemies must have felt before their worlds burned. Because for the first time in Xal'kyr history, they had encountered an enemy that did not want war. It wanted something else, and they did not understand what it was, which made it so much worse. Threxos turned away from the ruined fleet. His mind was already forming the only order that mattered now. "We leave," he said. Yulish hesitated. "Admiral, we leave," Threxos repeated. "We go back. We tell the Dominion what we saw. We make sure no one ever comes here again." His voice was iron. Final. The Xal'kyr Dominion would forget this system. They would erase its coordinates, strike it from every navigational database. They would never speak of this again. And if another empire, another species, another foolish fleet found what they, it would not be their problem. As the Xal'kyr fleet limped away, the stars remained silent. But in the void, something shifted. Something watched. Something waited. And far beyond the shattered remains of the battle, in the depths of human space, another warship awakened. Lights flickered along its hull. Names dozens, hundreds etched in steel, in circuits, in something not quite. The vessel stirred. A low, whispering hum rippled through the depths of its core. Another voice, calm and hollow, echoed into the void. Observation complete. New directive assigned. Next system, acquired. Then, it vanished. Gone. Moving toward the next battlefield. Wherever that would be. Wherever it was needed next. Wherever war would come again. Because war would always come. And when it did, they would be there. Waiting. The Xal'kyr fleet never returned to that sector. Not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. The official Dominion records classify the engagement as an encounter with an unidentified anomaly. The war fleet had suffered severe technical malfunctions, resulting in the loss of multiple vessels. No further investigation was required. A lie. A desperate, necessary lie. No records mentioned the human warship. No reports acknowledged the truth of what had happened in that empty void. The Xal'kyr Dominion could never admit that they had faced something they did. That they had seen war turned into something else. Something terrifying. Something that had looked at them, measured them, and then simply left. Admiral Threxos sat alone in his personal chambers, staring at the hollowed-out space where his fleet had once been. He had fought wars for centuries. He had stood over burning planets, watched civilizations kneel, crush defiance beneath the weight of Dominion supremacy. And yet, every time he closed his eyes, he saw them. Not the humans. Not anymore. They weren't human anymore. They were something else. Something worse. And the Dominion would never speak of them again. Threxos had ensured it. No Xal'kyr fleet would ever venture into that sector again. No probes, no scouts, no records. It would disappear from Dominion star charts, written out of history as a fit. And yet, deep in the pit of his mind, Threxos knew the truth. They had not escaped. They had simply been spared. For now, across the Dominion homeworld, the survivors of the fleet returned to silence. Not a single one of them spoke of what they had seen. Not one. Even the most battle-hardened warriors, the ones who had laughed in the face of war, sat in cold, terrified silence. Some of them had changed. They flinched at the sound of system scans. They refused to enter derelict ships. One officer, once a ruthless commander, refused to sleep in a room with active lights, whispering about patterns that didn't belong. And one night, he simply disappeared. No signs of forced entry. No record of his departure. Just gone. As if he had never existed. And the last thing he had said, to the few who dared to listen, "It's still looking at us." In the deep void, where no sensors could reach, something moved. Not a ship. Not a fleet. Something else. Something that had once been human. Its form shifted, adapting, waiting, listening. It had left the Xal'kyr for now, but the war never ended. It only moved forward. The last transmission from the Vengeance had been sent, and others like it were already listening. Not just in that sector. Not just in Xal'kyr space. Everywhere. The war machines, the fused minds, the ghosts of what humanity had become. They were still out there, and they were waiting for the next fleet, for the next war, for the next species to make the mistake the Xal'kyr had made. The mistake of looking too deep. The mistake of scanning something they did not understand. Because next time, the warform might not let them leave. And next time, there would be no survivors.